Today is a very important day as we're going to be kicking off the first episode of our Apps for Music Producers series with the legendary Koala Sampler app. I'm really stoked for this. Koala is where I would start if I was making music today. The app costs $5, it's on iOS and Android, and there are a few expansions for the app that really increase the capabilities, and those expansions, namely the Samurai Edition and the Mixer expansion, those are $4 and $5 respectively, so all together you can get into this app with all of the features for $14 to $16. I mean, compare that against, of course, a $500 SB404, which I'm not saying this can totally replace, but if you've already got a mobile device or a tablet, this app is a fantastic way to start your beat making journey. It's not just for beginners, there's some advanced features in this thing too, but we're going to cover the basics and the foundational stuff today so that you can start making beats with the Koala app. I'll link to all the tech that I'm using here in the description down below. I'm going to be using this tempo pad MIDI controller from Sonido. They make great MIDI controllers, and a lot of them are actually really great for mobile music production as well, because power can be an issue for connecting to a mobile device, and they've actually got a USB port that's for connecting to our device and a USB port that's for connecting to external power, which can be really handy if, say, your phone isn't providing enough power to the controller to make beats and use the controller at the same time. But enough about that, let's dive right into making beats with Koala. All right, so in the Koala app, we're going to be working with samples to create our beat. There's no virtual instruments here, though there's ways we can kind of create our own virtual instruments with a sample. We'll get to that in a moment. But as you can see here on the interface, I already have samples loaded up here. And there are different kinds of samples, right? We have drum samples, we have this sort of like melodic chop that I've got, and I even have a percussive loop here that will continue playing and actually loop until I stop it. And there's a couple ways we can get sound into the Koala app. On the sample page, you'll notice I have a button here that says import, but if I press that import button, it'll have a record from mic or resample from the app option as well. Recording from the mic means exactly what it says. We can use the iPad's microphone or your device's microphone to record into the app. So with mic selected, I can actually see the level jumping up as I speak because it's picking up me speaking. And I can also choose different effects for the audio coming into the iPad. So I could choose something like more bass, more treble, some fuzz, a robot, all these different effects depending on what kind of source you have. Let's throw some reverb on. And there's also a monitoring button here. If I click that now, I'm going to get some feedback, but it's a way for you to hear what you're sampling in. That works well if you're wearing headphones and you want to hear what the mic is picking up. With the mic selected and the reverb effects turned on, all I have to do is hold down an empty pad in Koala to start recording some sound. So now I've held down the record button, I snapped, and we have a super extreme reverb snap sound. I'm going to go ahead and take reverb off of that. Let's try to just do a dry snap and we'll work with it later. That one looks a lot cleaner. It's got some noise in the background, but we'll get into editing the sample in a moment. Since I don't want to keep that first one that we were using, I'm just going to press and hold it, drag it to the trash can. I mentioned two other ways of getting audio into the app. I can click that mic button again and go to import file. Now when I press a pad, we'll get a little menu here with the file system for the iPad or your mobile device, and you can import any kind of sample that you already have. So you can download these samples from a sample library, import them to your device from whatever source you have for getting samples. So here, there's some 909 samples. Let's go ahead and just grab a tom. I found that tom sample. If I click and drag this in onto a pad, now it's there. I can exit out of the little file browser. And we've got a new drum sound imported into the Koala app. The last recording feature, resampling from the app, I'm going to skip that for now because usually that comes a little later. That's a little more advanced. Basically, all it means is we're going to record the audio happening into the app into a pad on its own. We'll come back to that later. Once we have the audio on the individual pads, we can edit each one of them. So if I go ahead and press the edit button, we'll get to see the full waveform there. And we have a few options. The first one is one shot. What one shot means is that the entire sample is going to play when it gets triggered. If I turn that off, the sample will only play for as long as I hold down the pad. So you can hear I'm playing really quickly on that kick drum, so it's not playing the whole sample, which kind of sounds bad. So for our drum samples, we pretty much usually always want to be in one-shot mode. No matter how long I hold the pad, it'll play the whole sample. We also have the option to reverse the sample, to loop the sample. And I've actually done that with this shaker sample here. It's in loop mode. It's also got hold selected, which appears when we go into loop mode. That means that I don't have to hold down the pad for the shaker to continue to play. There's also a little sub menu under loop where we can ping pong, where it will loop going forward and then it will come back in reverse. And then you can also set a custom loop point, as well as crossfade, all right here from this loop menu. But this shaker sample is pretty simple. It's just 8 bars. It just continues to loop and loop until I stop it. All right, moving right along, we have another page here. We have attack, which the higher the attack value, the sample or the sound will fade in. It adds a little fade to the beginning of your track. Turn it up. Not something I would really want to use on this snare sample because the attack is the most important part. And then we have release, which is kind of the opposite. It's going to add a fade to the other side. You can hear I lose more and more of the tail of this hi-hat as I turn the release up. On a longer sample like this chop, if I turn the release down on that, the whole chop just plays until it finishes. Turning release up gradually fades the sample down over time. Attack and release are something you can play with depending on how you want the sound to behave when you trigger it. And then we have tone. See if you can hear the difference as I bring the tone to the right. We mostly get the high end of the sound, so we get a high pass filter. As I bring it down to the left, we get a low pass filter, so we're hearing mostly low frequencies from the samples. And one more page, we have choke. Choke in most samplers means that a single sample will always cut off another sample that's in the same choke group. So you can see that between these 4 samples, these are all on choke group 1. As I cycle through them, they're all on choke group 1. Because if these samples started overlapping each other, it would get really messy. In fact, let's go ahead and change to another choke group. And let me go ahead and turn down the release time so you can really hear what happens when these samples play full out and start to overlap each other. You can hear it gets really loud and messy and they start to overlap in a bad way. So choke groups are especially useful when you want one sample to cut off another sample. Stretch is for time stretching. You can turn this on or off. So for something that's more rhythmic, like this shaker sample that I have, it's being stretched because the original tempo of the sample does not match the tempo of the project, but we can stretch it so that it fits. You'll need to utilize stretch to play in time if you have rhythmic samples like that. There's a whole host of other tools here like normalization, bringing the volumes up to a normalized level, trimming silence, auto chop, stem splitting, turn a sample mono. These are all self-explanatory, and since we're trying to just do a beginner tutorial here, we're just gonna breeze through them for now. We did record a snap sample earlier, which kind of sounds like trash. You can really hear like my AC blaring in the background. So let's edit it a little bit. We can crop in on the sample here. Just click and drag that little left side so that we get really close to that start point. And then we probably don't need so long of a tail either. But now I can still hear the noise. So let's go over to our release value and let's turn release up. Now we're getting a nice fade that's fading down along with the snapping sound, so it's not carrying all of that extra noise at the end. If I change my endpoint to be a little closer, even better. I could use the tone slider to focus on mostly the high end frequency But there's actually one other way we can deal with the filtering of the sound, and that's under this Mix tab. Under the Mix tab, we get a little EQ for each individual sound. And we can EQ each sound in a different way. You can see as I go through these different drum sounds, they each have a slightly different EQ. Since this snap sound is mostly supposed to be in the high-end register, I can sweep out all of those low-end frequencies. It's essentially doing the same thing as the tone slider was doing, but if you want to be more manicured and try to pull out a specific frequency, using this mix EQ is the way to get a little more surgical with it. It's here in this tab that we can also determine which bus the sample goes to. We haven't really talked about buses yet, but essentially you can send each sample to one of 4 buses, or the master channel. These are essentially just different channels that you can send them to, because later on with the mixer, we can actually process each channel or each bus differently. So you can see bus A through D here. We know that the snap is only going to the main at the moment, so let's change that and let's have it match wherever the snare is going. Yeah, that's going to B, so let's send the snap to bus B. Now it's going to bus B, and I have a couple of effects on there, like a reverb, just a slightly subtle reverb, as well as a filter, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Last thing for editing these individual samples, you'll notice that we have volume, pitch, and panning for each sample. Volume is, of course, how loud the sample will be. We can actually turn this one up a little bit. We also have pitch. We can pitch down or up any sample. Let's pitch it up a little bit. And panning means the sound is going to go to the left or to the right. Let's pan slightly to the right. So with a combination of rhythmic loops, melodic one-shots, and drum one-shots, you can put together like a full song just in 16 or less pads, the first page of samples here in the Koala app. 1, 2, 3, 4. But we're kind of just getting started. We actually have more than one page here. We have A, B, C, and D. 4 pages of 16 pads that we can fill with different samples. And what happens if we want to turn a single sample, like this voice sound, into an instrument that we can play chromatically? Let's get into that next. All right, so here in my second bank of pads, I have a sample that is not a drum one-shot, and it's not like a rhythmic melodic thing. It's just a voice singing a single note. Now, one thing I could do is press and hold on this sample and copy it over to another pad. And then that second one, I could pitch up a few semitones. And I could do that several times and kind of create a melodic instrument out of this vocal sample. That's one way of doing it. But there is actually a way that we can play a single sample chromatically. Let's go over to the sequence tab now. Before we get into any of the other elements in the sequence tab, I want you to notice this little keyboard icon. If we press that keyboard icon and then press the vocal one shot, we now get a keyboard on screen. And if you didn't get a keyboard, you should use this drop-down menu here and notice that there's actually several ways you can play the instrument on your screen. There's grid, keyboard, which we were just on, note repeat, which this is very helpful for rhythmic samples. It'll repeat the sample at a certain interval. And then there's velocity, where I can play from quiet to loud. Another useful mode, especially for percussion, that you want to have a more natural sound if you can't get there on your touch screen. But I'm going to switch mine over to keyboard just because you can see the notes, and then I'm going to switch the tempo pad over to this chromatic mode, where I can play the different notes of the keyboard right from my MIDI controller. So now we've turned that single vocal into a full instrument. And of course, you can do this with any sample. Let's hop out of that mode. Let's go back to the sample page and import a new sample. If I go into the melodic folder here, I can find a guitar pluck, or let's try that longer sound, the guitar harmonic sound. If I drop that into our project, jump back over to sequence, keyboard icon, press the sample, What you notice is those notes are playing nice and long and they're really hanging over each other, but that's because we're in one-shot mode on the sample. So if I go back over to that menu we were in before, that whole sample is going to play through. This might be an instance where I might turn one shot off, so I can control how long that sample gets held for. And then so we don't have that snap sound at the end when I release, I might turn up the release a bit to get a little bit of a fade. Turn the attack up a little bit. Little pentatonic action. And that's how I might edit a sample like that. Also here on the tempo pad, these orange pads are octave buttons. So I can easily change the octave of my instrument. So it goes pretty well with using this chromatic mode on the Koala sampler. Now, even though I've changed away from the sequence page, if I switch the modes on my controller and I go back to like the drum mode, you're going to notice that I'm still playing notes on that instrument. That's because we've got that little keyboard icon there. We kind of have to pop out of that to go back to playing our normal pad assignments. And since we're speaking about it anyway, let me just show you in the menu, if you have a MIDI controller or if you need one, the tempo pad is a great companion for the Koala app. You can go into the settings menu, head over to MIDI, and you can use the Map MIDI button, which will allow you to assign any of your pads to any of the samples. So you can see that I've done that already in every single thing that you can adjust, from the play button to the record button to all the individual pads to the effects, which we haven't even gotten to yet. All of those can be mapped to a keyboard. And since the tempo pad has multiple pages of pads and banks, I have plenty of control of whatever I might need in the app. So I'm going to go out of mapping mode, and you can see that I've used the play button to map to the play button, of course. And I was able to use the editor app on the computer to make sure the buttons are functioning the way I want them to. For instance, I don't want to have to hold the play button down for it to play the project. I want to just hit play and it plays. And I want to hit it again to stop it. That's called a toggle switch in MIDI, as opposed to momentary, which would require me to hold down the button. I've also mapped the knobs to some performance effects. That can be a lot of fun, but we haven't even started talking about how to build that loop that we were just listening to, let alone the effects. So let's get into that now. So previously, we've mostly been in the sample page. That's where we do all of our sampling, our sample editing, etc. We've headed over to the sequence page. So I showed you how to play an instrument chromatically, but of course the sequence page is so we can start sequencing those notes. And you might have noticed this grid in sort of the top half of the app here in multiple pages. Each one of these gray boxes is an empty spot for us to basically put a new loop or a new pattern. And you can see that I have one there already. That's the pattern that we've been listening to. You can even see a little playhead continue to play across the loop as it goes. So if I wanted to record into an empty pattern, I could go ahead and click one of these empty pattern slots, turn my metronome on, which is going to be like a click track for me to play along with, press the record button, and we can make a new loop. Super basic, right? And a little off time, but we'll get into how to fix that in a moment. So we've created a new sequence here. And if you noticed, when I pressed record, it didn't immediately start recording. That's because we have a count in. Now it started recording. So basically it counts to 4 before the recording begins. You can adjust that in the settings under general and count in. And you can have it be 2 bars or 8 beats before you come in and start recording. Just gives you a little time from when you press record to do your performance. Of course, I've already chosen my BPM, or the tempo of my track. That's that rate that we're hearing when we play the metronome 3. That's 84 beats per minute. If I click and drag this to the right, we'll get faster tempos. If I click and drag it to the left, we'll get much slower tempos. I can also just click on this value and I get a bunch of options here. I can increase the BPM by 1. I can tap tempo, which means I can set the tempo by actually tapping in the feeling that I have of the beat. I can change our time signature, beats per bar. I can change quantization, which will line up our beats automatically. I can turn that on and select whether they're going to be quarter notes, eighth notes, all the way up to 64th notes. And I can also check the box to do a live quantization, meaning my notes will get lined up as I play them live. And we also have sequence snapping, which you can change how we change from one sequence to another, the transition between the two. I have it set to sequence end so that when one sequence ends, the new one will begin. So since I have two sequences here now, let me play the first one, which I believe is 4 bars. Now if I press this second sequence that we created, it's not going to start playing until this first sequence ends. So here comes the transition. Right there, and it's just going to continue looping until I say choose the next sequence, when it'll wait till the end and then transition right away, I should say. You can adjust how that behaves. I think sequence end works well for me, but you can have it so it transitions on the next bar or on the next beat or completely off where it changes instantaneously. Listening back to the sequence that we've created, the new one, we can hear it's a little bit off. And if we double click into that, we actually get a full MIDI roll of the notes. We can zoom in vertically or horizontally. And we get a grid here where we can move our notes around. I'll do it with the pencil just so I can be a little more precise. But if I wanted to move that kick around, I could click and drag it and you can see that it's snapping to the grid that's going to be completely in time with our song. If you didn't want that snapping to happen because you want the beat to be a little off the grid, you can go into the snapping menu and you can change the time. And not only can you change the grid that we're looking at, but you can also set it to free, which means it's not going to snap. In this mode, you can also tap in new notes. So if you wanted to just completely draw in a pattern on the grid, you can do that as well. You don't need to play everything in live. Right now we're on the pencil tool, meaning we're drawing in notes. By the way, if I just press a note, it'll delete. We can go to velocity mode, which will have us changing the velocity for each note. The velocity is like how hard we hit it, which usually results in a louder or softer sound. Softer is a lower sound, harder is a louder sound. So we can change that for each note. I don't know if you can see it there, but there's a little red bar that changes as we dial it up and down on each note. The next option we have is chance, or the probability that a note will happen. We can drag that up and down the same way. This means that every time the pattern plays, the note will have that percentage chance of playing. So if you set it to 70%, that note will play 70% of the time, which is actually a good way to have shorter loops play a little more organically and not be so repetitive. Let me also bring you back to the chromatic sample, the vocal. And just note that you can record these chromatic samples in the same way. If I double click into that sequence, you can see that now instead of just being on a grid, we are on a chromatic piano roll. So instead of these being the pad names here on the left, we have note names, C2, C3, and C4, and all the notes in between. Also, so far, as we've recorded, all of the loops have been 1-bar loops. Even if I double tap into a blank loop, I can change that right here at the top from 1 bar. I can instantly double it. That continues to work. Or I can just continue to increase these to say a 4-bar loop to whatever size loop we want. Now, if I go back into one of these pre-existing loops, that's actually really helpful. And since I was in chromatic mode, we have the keyboard lit up here. If I tap that, we go back to our normal grid mode where we're going to see our individual one-shots on the grid here. But what I was trying to say was, if we double up this pre-existing loop, it doesn't just double the length and leave empty space, it will actually double the loop. So the pattern continues along with the doubling. Whereas if I change this to now 5 bars from 4, we will have an empty bar instead of it having copied what was in the previous bar. So you can use double up to easily copy over notes as well, not just change the length of the loop. All right, so now that we know how to create sequences, you can create a bunch of different patterns here and transition between them. You've got a lot of space here for different patterns. So now we can transition onto the performance page. I think I messed up my BPM earlier. We're supposed to be at 84, right? Go ahead and play that initial pattern. So here, as you can see on screen, I have a mixer right now, but that will usually be down here in the menu below to bring that up. Let's come back to that in a moment and deal with some fun stuff here. We have performance effects, vanilla and strawberry, just 2 different flavors. Vanilla, some kind of like, you could say more basic effects like filtering. Oh, by the way, yes, I have this mapped. I'm not going to go through each one of them now. You can go ahead and go through each one of them and start to play. But I want to point out this hold button here because previously, as I've been triggering these effects, like if I bring the cutter all the way up like this, it'll snap back down as soon as I release, right? But if I use the hold button, it won't snap back down like that. It will hold its position until I bring it back down. So you can switch between your different patterns, you can trigger your different effects, and if you want to record that performance all together, you can go up to the hamburger menu, click record song, press OK, and as soon as we hit the play button, the time will start ticking up and we'll start recording. So if I hit play, actually let's turn the filter up a bit. That's under vanilla, right? Let's turn the filter up, press play. You can see that the clock has started running. And just fade it down. Press play again, and the recording has stopped, and we can go ahead and label this anything we want, and we'll get an audio file of our song. That wasn't really a proper performance, so I'm not going to save that, but it's that simple to record your performances. I want to also note that not only can you record your performances, but there's an export feature where we get a few different formats to export, including Ableton Live Drum Rack, meaning we can open up this grid of samples in Ableton Live, Ableton Live Set, which means we can open it up as session clips. There's even an Ableton Live Lite code in this app. And then there's also options to export individual samples or the individual sequences or all the sequences. So a lot of options there. And I want to circle back to the sample page once more, because if you remember, there's one more recording method that we can use, which is resampling from the app. So if I choose the resample from app option, then I go back to the perform tab, just press play. And then when I'm ready, I'm going to actually record this beat that's playing. Resampling from the app. So now, let's go ahead and pause that. Oh yeah, I have a controller. I keep forgetting. I have a controller. Now, pressing this pad, we have that whole thing as a one-shot, apparently, that won't stop playing. Edit. This can be really fun, resampling and going down this whole rabbit hole, because now you can treat this sample like an individual sample on its own, messing with the pitch, messing with different effects. We can reverse it. You can have a lot of fun. Then we can chop this sample up, which we didn't even really get into chopping today. Let me know if we need a part 2 to this video. You can have a lot of fun with resampling from the app. So I think the last thing that we didn't touch on is the fact that there's mute and solo buttons down here. If I wanted to solo a sample, I could hold solo and press the sample I want to solo. Same logic for muting. Hold down mute, press the sample you want to mute. Now there's no more kick. If I want to bring it back in, just bring it back in. Finally, jump back over to the performance tab. We played with all the fun performance effects. Take a look at the mixer, which we sort of talked about earlier. Basically, each one of those individual samples can go to its own bus, because you might want to treat certain samples differently. For instance, bus A is specifically the kick. You can see it jump every time the kick cuts through. I've added a little drive. Not too much though. So I can treat my kick differently, but also if you notice on bus D, there is a sidechain effect. That is going to take a signal source from bus A, meaning everything that goes to bus D is going to be ducking under the kick. So let's hit play, solo. You can kind of hear like a breathing, like a pumping a little bit. It's matching up with the kick. Everything the kick does is ducking this track. Every time the kick hits, we get a side chain. So that's one really important reason to use buses. But also, like, bus B is most of my top end percussion. So I might want to process that a little bit differently than like my main sample. I've got like a delay on here. And if you haven't noticed, there's a ton of really amazing effects that you can add here in the mixer. Those are different from the effects that we were using as like momentary performance effects. This is another whole rabbit hole that you can go down, but here's a whole list of the effects that we have. Tape, warble, ring modulation, a noise gate, limiter, drive, delay, anything you might need pretty much is here in the mixer effects. That's the 4 buses. And then we have the main, which all the buses are going to the main anyway. So if you want to put some type of, mastering effect on the main track, you can do that. We've got a limiter here on the master, but all of these individual effects are at your disposal here to use across the buses and on the main track. And I think this is a little self-explanatory, but obviously you have control over your mix in the mixer. We have volumes here as well. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully you have a basic foundational understanding of the Koala app and you're ready to make your own beats with this thing. Like I said, if I was just starting out today making beats, I would pretty much probably be exclusively using the Koala app on whatever mobile device I had. To me, the value for what you're actually getting for paying what, like $16 with all the expansions it's a crazy value and a crazy tool. It's essentially like having an SP404 built into your phone or your tablet. Nothing can replace the OG 404 or a dedicated piece of hardware, but this can get you really, really far. So let me know if you found this video helpful, if you want possibly a part 2 to this video, or if there's an app that I should check out next, let me know down in the description. I want to thank Sonido again for sponsoring this. If you need a cool controller to use with your mobile apps, the Tempo Pad is great for Koala, and they've also got a couple other great controllers in their catalog as well. That's going to be it for now. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.